पर तुम इतना बोल तो सकते थे कि सीढ़ियों से आना वापस। आता मैं ऊपर, आज ऑफिस बनते ना सारे के सारे, तो मैं यहाँ घूम रहा था भटकता। हम क्या पढ़ते हैं? लॉ ऑफ टॉर्ट्स। वाह यार, ऑलमोस्ट समाप्ति आता होगा। पुष्पम पास्ता ने वेरी गुड डिसीजन बेटा। क्या पढ़ रहे थे? टॉर्ट्स। आंसर लिखने वाले, राइट। यस, लाइव वाले बार बार लिखाओ, पधारे। डन सरकार, चले लिखा जाए थोड़ा बहुत। स्ट्रिक्ट लाइबिलिटी से लिखना है ना अपने को। स्ट्रिक्ट लाइबिलिटी हो गया, सॉरी, वाइकेरियस लाइबिलिटी से लिखना है। चलिए कुछ प्रीवियस ईयर के क्वेश्चन उठाए जाएं। अच्छा, डैमनम्स एंड इंजुरी लिख लिया अपन ने, इंजुरीज एंड डैमनम लिख लिया, रूल ऑफ स्ट्रिक्ट लाइबिलिटी लिख लिया, रेमेडीज अंडर लॉ ऑफ टॉर्ट्स, जुडिशियल एक्स्ट्रा जुडिशियल लिख लिया। Strict liability, Swaraj an employer of ABC Company Limited appointed Rakesh as an independent contractor. Discuss स्वराज की लाइबिलिटी कब कब आएगी? रूल वर्सेस रेलन वर्सेस फ्लेचर, लाइबिलिटी फॉर इनएविटेबल एक्सीडेंट, लाइबिलिटी फॉर इनएविटेबल मिस्टेक। ओके, डिस्कस द वाइकेरियस और टॉर्टियस लाइबिलिटी ऑफ स्टेट फॉर द एक्ट ऑफ हिज सर्वेंट, रेफर रेलेवेंट जजमेंट्स एज वेल। ये लिख ले, वाइकेरियस लाइबिलिटी का आंसर भी हो जाएगा, केसेस भी आ जाएंगे इसके अंदर। तो आप क्या इसको अपनी चार्ट बुक्स में कंटिन्यू कर रहे हो? डन, परफेक्ट, गो हेड, राइट। क्वेश्चन लिख दीजिए। कहां पे? इंडिपेंडेंट कॉन्ट्रैक्टर लिखा है ना। प्रिंसिपल एजेंट में इंडिपेंडेंट कॉन्ट्रैक्टर कैसे लाएगा? इंडिपेंडेंट कॉन्ट्रैक्टर इज अ साइन ऑफ स्ट्रिक्ट लाइबिलिटी, और अगर इंडिपेंडेंट कॉन्ट्रैक्टर हट जाता तो प्रिंसिपल एजेंसी लगाता। बोलू? कौन सा क्वेश्चन लिख रहे हैं सर? दिसंबर नहीं, जून 2019। इसके नीचे जो अनिल और अमित वाला क्वेश्चन है, ये भी वाइकेरियस लाइबिलिटी का दिख रहा है क्या? Where the partner is liable for the tort of another partner, ये आप खुद एक घर पे होमवर्क करना। अनिल एंड अमित वाला, ऊपर वाला मैं डिटेल में लिखा के दे रहा हूं, ऑफ द वाइकेरियस एंड टॉर्टियस लायबिलिटी ऑफ द स्टेट और द एक्ट ऑफ इट्स सर्वेंट। चले चलिए, generally the tortfeasor is liable for the torts committed by himself. Generally a tortfeasor is liable for the tort committed by himself, but in certain cases he may be held liable for the torts of another. For the torts of another. For the torts of another. Next point. Such cases are when a principal is held liable for the act of his agent. Such cases are when a principal is held liable for the act of his agent. Partners for the act of another partner. Partners for the act of another partner. And master for the act of his servant. And master for the act of his servant. बोलोगे? नेक्स्ट पॉइंट. इसमें मास्टर सर्वेंट ही बोला था ना इन लोगों ने. मैंने जून 2019 बोला है क्या? सॉरी. इसमें वाइकेरियस लायबिलिटी ऑफ द स्टेट पूछा हुआ है. मैंने वाइकेरियस लायबिलिटी, मैंने स्टेट पढ़ा नहीं, मैंने खाली वाइकेरियस और टॉर्टियस लायबिलिटी पढ़ लिया फॉर द एक्ट ऑफ हिज सर्वेंट. इस क्वेश्चन को भी मैं लिखा के देता हूं, मतलब इसका खाली क्वेश्चन मैं बाद में चेंज करवा दूंगा. आई विल मेक यू राइट पहले फर्स्ट वाइकेरियस लायबिलिटी, फिर खाली ऊपर से क्वेश्चन कट करके मैं वो क्वेश्चन चेंज करा दूंगा. सो कंटिन्यू दिस आंसर. आई एम वेरी सॉरी. ये वाला आंसर भी मैं लिखा के देता हूं. पधारे आगे. नेक्स्ट पॉइंट. नेक्स्ट है डालना टाइप्स ऑफ वाइकेरियस लायबिलिटी. टाइप्स ऑफ वाइकेरियस लायबिलिटी. टाइप्स ऑफ वाइकेरियस लायबिलिटी. Types of vicarious liability. A. Principal and agent. A. Principal agent. इसके अंदर डैश करके लिखेंगे. A principal is liable for the acts of his agent. A principal is liable for the acts of his agent committed in the course of his duties. The same was seen in Lloyd versus Grace. The same was seen in Lloyd versus Grace. The same was seen in Lloyd versus Grace, where the managing clerk fraudulently induced, a lady to transfer her property to him. Without the principal being aware of the same. Without the principal being aware for the. मैंने ये बोला ना, without the principal being aware for the same. However, the principal was still held liable. However, the principal was still held liable. Next point, partners. A tortuous act by one partner renders all the other partners, renders all the other partners, renders all the other partners vicariously liable as their liability is joint and several, as their liability is joint and several, as their liability is joint and several. इसी पार्टनर के अंदर एक और पॉइंट लिखना है, सब पॉइंट है, आप चाहें तो खाली लाइन चेंज करके लिख दें तब भी चलता है. In Hamlin versus Houston and Company, in Hamlin versus Houston and Company, a partner indulged into bribing an employee of a competitor firm, an employee of a competitor firm, an employee of a competitive firm, without the other partner being aware, without the other partner being aware, comma, both the partners were held liable. Both the partners were held liable. Next point, master and servant. Master and servant. A master is liable. A master is liable. A master is liable for the torts committed by his servant. A master is liable for the torts committed by his servant. A master is liable for the torts committed by his servant in the course of employment. In the course of employment, comma, the servant of course is liable as their liability is joint and several. As their liability is joint and several. Done. अब इस ऊपर वाले क्वेश्चन को कट कर लीजिएगा और उसकी जगह जो मैं क्वेश्चन बोल रहा हूं वो लिख लीजिएगा. क्वेश्चन कट करेगा. एक्सप्लेन द रूल ऑफ वाइकेरियस. लाइव वाले बच्चों, ये जो आंसर अपन ने लिखाया ये इस क्वेश्चन का नहीं है जो मैंने बोला. सो एक्सप्लेन द रूल ऑफ वाइकेरियस लाइबिलिटी विद द हेल्प ऑफ केस लॉज. पुट अप द क्वेश्चन. एक्सप्लेन द रूल ऑफ वाइकेरियस लाइबिलिटी विद द हेल्प ऑफ केस लॉज. डन. अब नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन आप एक पहले मेरा बनाया हुआ लिखिए और फिर ये. इससे क्या होगा ना कि आपकी चार्ट बुक भी कंप्लीट हो जाएगी. ये वाला आंसर भी लिखवा देता हूं. बोलो क्वेश्चन लिखिए. स्टेट द लाइबिलिटी ऑफ एन एम्प्लॉयर. State the liability of an employer for the acts of his servant, for the acts of his servants which has been done in an authorized way by him, which has been done by an unauthorized, which has been done in an unauthorized way by him. which has been done in an unauthorized way by him. Go ahead, write the answer. Bolu, an employer is held liable. An employer is held liable. An employer is held liable whenever his servant commits a tort. Whenever his servant commits a tort in the course of employment. In the course of employment. In the course of his employment. Second point. An act is considered deemed to be. An act is considered deemed to be. An act is considered deemed to be in the course of employment. An act is considered deemed to be in the course of employment if, अब ABC A और B करके लिखना A, a wrongful act has been authorized by the employer. A wrongful act has been authorized by the employer. A wrongful act has been authorized by the employer. B. An unauthorized mode, और लिखा ना उसके आगे आपने, by the employer, और B करके आपको लिखना है an unauthorized way of doing something. An unauthorized way of doing something authorized by the employer. Authorized by the employer. Authorized by the employer. Next point. In Century Insurance Company Limited. Next point है, right? In Century Insurance Company Limited versus Northern Ireland Road Transport. Dash करके लेना. This case here discussed. This case here discussed the liability of the employer. The case here discussed the liability of the employer. The case here discussed the liability of the employer for an unauthorized way of doing an act. For an unauthorized way of doing an act by his employee. आपको समझ में, मैंने इसके आगे लाइन क्यों लिखी? क्योंकि क्वेश्चन में मैंने केस में ये लाइन लिख के दी थी, तो मैं जस्टिफाई कर रहा था कि ये केस उस केस से डील करता है, इसीलिए मैं इस केस को कोट कर रहा हूं. नाउ इसके अंदर फैक्ट्स ऑफ द केस लिखेगा. एक फैक्ट्स भी आप क्या करो, खाली फैक्ट्स लिखना, फैक्ट्स ऑफ द केस में मत लिखना. फैक्ट्स खाली नेक्स्ट लाइन में लिखना फैक्ट्स, उसके आगे डैश करके लिखेंगे द ड्राइवर ऑफ अ पेट्रोल लॉरी. द ड्राइवर ऑफ अ पेट्रोल लॉरी. The driver of a petrol lorry, while transferring petrol, struck a match. Struck a match to light a cigarette. to light a cigarette. To light a cigarette. And then threw it a light on the floor. Threw it a light on the floor, because of which an explosion took place. Because of which an explosion took place. लाइन चेंज करना, जजमेंट लिखना और डैश करना. The House of Lords still held the employer liable. The House of Lords still held the employer liable because the employee did an act. Because the employee did an act in the course of employment and he did the work in an unauthorized way. For which he was employed to do. खत्म. Done. Now जो क्वेश्चन कट कराया था वो लिखो. लाइव लल्लू पल्ले पड़ रहा है तुम्हारे. बोलो. In India, there is no specific provision. With regards to the liability of state. The liability of state. However, the same has been approached by the court in a different way. In a different way. Where they have distinguished between the various functions performed by the government. The various functions performed by the government. Next point. Next point. The functions have been divided under two heads. The functions have been divided under two heads. The functions have been divided under two heads. The function have been divided under two heads. A, sovereign functions. इसके अंदर डैश कर लेंगे. These are functions. These are functions which are generally performed by the state. Which are generally performed by the state. Which are generally performed by the state. And are in the nature of welfare functions, or such functions which can only be, or such functions which can only be performed by the state, or such functions which can only perform by the state. दूसरा डालना नॉन सोवरेन functions. हाँ जी, तो हम थे नॉन सोवरेन फंक्शंस पे. अब नेक्स्ट नॉन सोवरेन फंक्शंस. In this, the state typically competes with private players. In this, the state typically competes with the private players. Typically competes with the private players. And are those functions which can be performed by anyone. And are those functions which can be performed by anyone. And are those functions which can be performed by anyone. Next point. In state of Rajasthan versus Vidyavati, इनमें में अपने से केसेस भी पूछे ना. अब ये केसेस के साथ साथ आपका ये टॉपिक भी कवर हो रहा है, रोल ऑफ स्टेट इन लॉ ऑफ टॉर्ट्स. इन स्टेट ऑफ राजस्थान वर्सेस विद्यावती, a driver of a government jeep, a driver of a government jeep, a driver of a government jeep knocked down a person, knocked down a person, knocked down a person walking on the footpath, walking on the footpath. Because of his negligent driving. Because of his negligent driving. खाली लाइन चेंज करना, केस वही चलेगा. Later, the injured person died in the hospital. And a case was filed against the state. And a case was filed against the state. and the court held it to be a non-sovereign function and made the state liable. And the court held it to be a non-sovereign function, and the court held it to be a non-sovereign function and held the state liable. Vicariously liable. Held the state vicariously liable. Done. Next point. अब नेक्स्ट केस लिखेंगे अपन. In Kasturi Lal versus State of UP. In Kasturi Lal versus State of UP, large quantity of gold was seized from a person. Large quantity of gold was seized by a person. But later, the accused was acquitted. But later, the accused was acquitted. But later, the accused was acquitted. But the gold was not returned. But the gold was not returned. But the gold was not returned. As the head constable took away all the gold and absconded. Took away all the gold and absconded. And a suit was filed against the state. And a suit was filed against the state. Line change करेंगे. However, the Supreme Court refused the claim, stating, however, the Supreme Court refused the claim, stating that it was a sovereign function, and it was a sovereign function and the state cannot be held liable for sovereign functions. And the state cannot be held liable for the sovereign actions. Done. केसेस भी हो गए. ये केसेस आपके लिए बहुत अच्छे हो गए. ठीक है, इसका आगे कुछ तो जरूरी नहीं है. ओके, रॉन्ग ऑफ पर्सन सेफ्टी एंड फ्रीडम. इसको एक मैं आपको चार्ट बना के दे रहा हूं और एक होमवर्क क्वेश्चन आपको भी दे रहा हूं. मैंने तीनों ही लिखा दिए जो मैं आपको बोलने वाला था, वो सारे आंसर्स हो गए. तो अब टॉर्ट्स ऑफ सेफ्टी में एक मलिशियस प्रोसिक्यूशन का आंसर लिखा के दे दूं क्या? एक मैं ही करा देता हूं. टॉर्ट अगेंस्ट पर्सनल सेफ्टी. अच्छा, इसको थोड़ा थोड़ा सा लिखते चलो बस अपने चार्ट्स में. बैटरी मतलब क्या होगा? द यूज ऑफ फोर्स even if the force used is very trivial, it will still amount to battery. डिफेंस लिखने की जरूरत नहीं है. assault when by the act of any person. The plaintiff apprehends contact. It is an act of the defendant to cause an apprehension in the mind of plaintiff that battery may be committed. Bodily harm में तो कुछ लिखने की जरूरत नहीं है. When a person is restrained from leaving or moving from any place without any lawful justification, that is false imprisonment, nervous shock, any kind of injury to the mind by what a person has seen or heard. Nervous shock alone is not sufficient. Some injury must take place. नेक्स्ट है डेफिनेशन. ये अपन ने पूरा ही लिखा हुआ है तो वी डोंट नीड दिस. एंड नेग्लिजेंस. एक क्वेश्चन और आंसर लिख लेते हैं. और इसके नीचे रेमेडीज है. रेमेडीज का आंसर मैंने लिखा भी दिया एंड उसका चार्ट भी बना दिया. तो लास्ट आंसर ट्राइवल. ट्राइवल TRIVIAL मतलब इवन अगर बहुत ही लिटिल भी हो तब भी. डन. क्वेश्चन लिखें. हो गया सबका लिख के. रुकता मैं एक मिनट लिख लो. Done? 2019. To the last answer before we switch off this video. Malicious prosecution, right? Chale. Malicious prosecution means instigating a judicial proceeding. Means instigating a judicial proceeding. Means instigating a judicial proceeding against another person, against another person, against another person without reasonable and probable cause. Without reasonable and probable cause, which terminates in the favor of another. Which terminates in the favor of another. And results into damage to the reputation. And results into damage to the reputation or property. Or property. Next point. Following are the essential elements. Following are the essential elements. Following are the essential elements. A. There must have been a prosecution of the plaintiff by the defendant. Case 2 याद रखना हमेशा इसमें. There must have been a prosecution of the plaintiff by the defendant. B. There must have been want of reasonable and probable cause. There must have been reasonable and probable cause. There must have been want of reasonable and probable cause for that prosecution. For that prosecution. C. The defendant must have acted maliciously. The defendant must have acted maliciously. D. The plaintiff must have suffered damages. The plaintiff must have suffered damages. The prosecution must have ended in favor of the plaintiff. The prosecution must have ended in favor of the plaintiff. The prosecution must have ended in favor of the plaintiff. The prosecution must have ended in favor of the plaintiff. Perfect. Done. That's it. तो ये खत्म, समाप्ति. ठीक है. लाइव वाले ले लो. अब ये लोग कुछ ठूसेंगे तो हम आपको 10 मिनट में इत्तला करते हैं कि कब ये सब मानसिक तौर से यहाँ पर आ चुके हैं और फिर वापस मिलते हैं. ठीक है, चलिए. लॉ ऑफ टॉर्च स्टैंड्स कंप्लीट. थैंक यू सो मच. जय हिंद, जय महाराष्ट्र. हैव अ गुड वन. बाय.